international policymakers that listen to Rocket Therapy. Hello out there. Hope you're enjoying the show.
Hi, I'm Anna.
And I'm Logan.
This is Rocket Therapy, the official podcast of Edmonds College Rocketry. Today, we're going to be talking about orbital debris mitigation.
Or as I like to call it, the space junk discussion.
How should we start off?
Let's talk about why is it even a conversation? I mean, it has come up before. So why do people talk about this in the first place?
So, space debris is serious because any piece that's floating around can either damage working equipment in orbit, potentially causing harm to whatever functions satellites have, whether that be like collecting data on space objects, communication purposes, or navigation and weather, and so on, damage these functions.
So how big of a threat do we think it is right now? We've been sending stuff up into orbit for a while. So is it getting worse now? Is it getting better? Where are we currently? So I think that start off with we could talk about what is currently up there, how much of what, and do we know where it is? So how many satellites? Have you seen a good count on satellites that we actually have active and track?
I saw on the European Space Agency's website that there's over 2,218 working satellites, but that's just functioning currently. So we've also got 34,000 objects that are greater than 10 centimeters and 900,000 objects from 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters and 128 million objects from greater than 1 millimeter to 1 centimeter.
I
So
mean,
there's a lot.
yeah, it's a lot of different classes. And the number I got just for satellites was back from just March. They had at 2,666. This is according to the Union of Concerned Scientists. So people consider this pretty important. So I kind of want to start off there before we get into the junk part or the unknowns, just what's actively up there, why is it up there, and like who manages it. So like where do you get permission to actually launch something into space and put it in a spot is kind of a big question um, with this. And there seem to be, from what I've read, two different categories that we look at. There's the geostationary orbits, which are pretty heavily regulated. But then there's the low to mid Earth orbits, which not so much. So, what have you seen as far as how geostationary orbits are assigned?
Yeah, geostationary orbit, I've noticed is pretty common for communication satellites because they won't have to track satellites, because the orbital path is equal to the rotation of the Earth.
They're virtually stationary up there, is how we usually think of them,
Yeah.
which means that's kind of easy to manage. And what I was able to find was that it's actually managed by the International Telecommunications Union, also known as the ITU, and they assign those orbits based on requests, and they give them 15 years of basically a lease at that orbit before they can give it to someone else. And it actually gets a little bit unintentionally, how would you say, uh, unpopulated because there is a practice that they try to discourage, but companies will just claim orbits like, oh, we have a plan to put something up there, we promise. So don't give this one to anyone else, but we really plan to put something up there, but they don't. But as opposed to that, you have the low and mid Earth orbits, which, from what I've been able to find, are just make sure you're safe, find a good place for it, deconflict when necessary, which does make me feel a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah. I agree. I've noticed that, there are national kind of guidelines and policies that have been set for, orbit assignment. there's no like, would you say this? There's no regulator. So,
Yeah. Nothing really binding.
yeah,
And even with the geostationary orbits, I mean, definitely with the low and mid Earth ones, but even with the geostationary orbits, there's always, certain nations that say, well, you group of nations came up with those rules. We didn't sign on to it. So why should we listen? And they just, do whatever they want. So we have to deal
exactly.
with them. So, I mean, anything we talk about in this conversation about what to do still requires them somehow getting on board, which is sadly a bit doubtful.
The problem with having a national regulator is that US satellites will be at a disadvantage compared to satellites that don't have regulations in other countries. So this makes me wonder, like I know we have a loose loose a global initiative of some sort that kind of has very basic guidelines and rules for launching into orbit. It makes me wonder if there's a way to make stricter rules internationally.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to the next point. So, on our last conversation about satellites and astronomers, I said something that I found out was incorrect. And that was about the requirement that for low Earth, they deorbit when their life is up, and for geostationary, they go into a junk orbit. Turns out that that's just a big suggestion. It's not an absolute requirement. It's a good practice. A lot of countries do it. I think that the US almost completely does it, but the only country so far that has actually written that into a law is France. So not even the ESU as an organization, but just France says we will have that as a requirement for all of our satellite launches. And that seems kind of weird too, with the whole parking assignment for GSO. They say you can have it for 15 years. It seems like there should be an additional requirement. We won't give it to you unless you have a plan. But apparently, you could say, yeah, we'll just have it for 15 years, but have no plan to leave it when your 15 years are up.
So, does this apply to just a complete deorbit, or does this include orbiting to kind of the junkyard orbit?
Yeah, it's both. So if you're low enough where it's reasonable to actually deorbit, then you deorbit and dump it at Point Nemo if possible in the middle of the Pacific. But if you're up high, I mean, especially geostationary, then boost up to the junk orbit, and that's where we leave it, and it'll basically stay there forever. And any impacts that happen up there, when we ever get to that part, are actually pretty low velocity.
Mhm.
It's because a lot of them are sharing the same inclination. But yeah, we'll save that part for a little bit later.
Yeah. Also,
So yeah, yes.
just for clarification, so um, you can launch into orbit without a plan to deorbit to either junkyard orbit or the complete deorbit.
Um, from what I've seen, yes, unless you're France. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't entities within organizations that give approval. They'll say, oh, no, you need to do this. And you might point out that that's not actually a requirement. They say, okay, well, we'll focus on whatever other reason to block you until you put this into practice. Or maybe there's just enough, you know, how would you say, peer pressure between organizations. Say, hey, we're all doing this, so if you want to have a good reputation, you do it. It might be driven by that, and it's happening, but it would be nice to actually have a law. And as far as I know, you're not breaking any laws by launching without a plan.
Yeah.
So did you get a chance, while we're still on satellites, to take a look at the 2009 Iridium Cosmos collision, or a
Um,
video of it?
yes, I did. I watched a video and I looked at a few sites, but the Iridium and Cosmos collision was February 10th, 2009, and I think it was the first collision between two satellites in history, right? Um, So
Yes, I don't think it was the first collision between objects in orbit, but two full satellites.
yeah,
Yes.
okay. So I'm just gonna put a little bit of information about that. So it was an inactive Russian communication satellite.
With no plan to deorbit.
Yes, and then I think it was almost perpendicularly collided with Iridium, which was an active U.S. satellite at the time. Produced about 2,000 pieces of debris that were 10 centimeters or larger in diameter, but also didn't count the smaller pieces that could have gone to like the thousands as well, which all this is orbiting Earth with everything else and increasing the chance of damaging other low orbit flights.
Yeah, I think I actually read somewhere that there was a sizable chunk that came within 30 kilometers of the ISS, which that's far and it's close, depending on how you look at this. It's scary. It's not good, but it it was a bit of a mess. And how would you describe the video?
Um, well, it was pretty impressive, I've got to say. Watching the model of the debris spread, it was more than I imagined.
Yeah, that was a lot of pieces. I was surprised at how many that it broke up into. But the
And
spread is something I'm going to
spread.
want to get to because at first it looks like a spread, but very quickly afterwards, you see that they're still following essentially the original path that they were on. They just spread out. So they didn't go wide, they just spread out lengthwise on their orbits. But that's still a lot of stuff to end up, even though most of it has, I think it's by 2012, most of it had deorbited that we could
Yes.
tell.
Yeah.
So that's good. It does clean itself up. And, you know, uh, satellites in low Earth orbit have to continuously be boosted just to maintain their orbits. So things there are going to fall down after not too long. But speaking of junk, what sources of space junk are your biggest concerns, or have you looked at?
I know that there's just six um basic satellite parts flying around, but there's also this might not be in the podcast. Remember the name? There's some sort of rocket that was emitted that also counts as space junk because I don't know what it's called. You know?
Oh, are you talking about solid rocket boosters?
Yes.
They have aluminum. Aluminum's a big component of solid rocket motors, and you actually get a bit of alumina slag that comes out the back of them and solidifies into pieces. And those are pretty popular for a lot of how would you say not primitive, but uh, simple orbital launches because solid rocket motors don't need an atmosphere. They have the oxidizer built into them. So you end up with a lot of this alumina slag up there, which who knows how long it's going to be up there, maybe not very long at all, but it's not very trackable. So it's definitely a bit of a concern. You also have things like a few spent stages can stay up there. Like the Falcon 9 upper stage, they deorbit that thing, but it does make it into orbit before it releases the payload. Then they allow it to separate, then it just reverses and burns retrograde and comes back down. Not everyone has done that. And there's just incidentals, staging itself, separating of like the first and second stage or second and third, depending on what rocket you're talking about. Not all of them have a very clean stage. In fact, none of them really have a very clean staging thing. They're always going to drop off something. If you watch a Falcon 9 launch right after the stage, you'll usually see on the upper stage nozzle this ring. It's a cork ring that it helps keep it aligned and protected while it's tucked into the first stage, it'll come off and fly backwards. Now at that point, generally it's not in, well, it isn't in orbit, so that'll come down, but you have weird stuff like that that happens. So those things are kind of how they track, and obviously this piece of cork does not have the ability to burn retrograde. It just has to depend on the light atmospheric drag to come down.
I found coolant residue.
Coolant residue?
Yeah, I found on a presentation on NASA's website, and it's talking about sodium potassium droplets. Using that as coolant, something that happens anymore.
I think it'd be worked up. I mean, apparently they come up to 5 to 7 centimeters, and at orbital speeds, that is dangerous. That stuff is dense enough to do damage. I mean, you've seen the cracks on like the space shuttle from paint chips. So this is worse. Again, it does come down. So what were the numbers you gave me on how much junk is up there, like from the small to the untrackable stuff?
Yeah, so there's 34,000 objects that are larger than 10 centimeters, 900,000 objects greater than 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters, 128 million objects from greater than 1 millimeter to 1 centimeter.
And now all that stuff is being tracked, or is this an estimate based off of likelihood of stuff being produced?
So, the larger than 10 centimeter is being tracked by the DoD, and smaller objects are being tracked by NASA's Orbital Debris Program, which is more of a estimate because, unlike the DoD, they're not tracking the actual object, but they're more taking a risk assessment for collisions.
So is it that they know how much was probably created and how long it lasts up there is the general idea?
Yeah.
So I wasn't able to find that much on how the stuff is tracked. From what I saw, it's for low Earth orbit stuff, it's all radar. Well, it's not all radar, but that's where they can use radar. And for everything like low Earth orbit up to geostationary, it's really only optical. You can't use radar to do it. But you said risk margins. That's kind of our next big thing to talk about here is I think that's the central question here. It's not, are we on the verge of something catastrophic happening necessarily, but are we getting to the point where it's just too risky? What have you seen for risk margins?
What I've been able to find risk margins is just how they model and take risk assessments. I haven't been able to find actual numbers.
So how do they make those risk assessments then?
NASA uses, like I said, their orbital debris program. They use radars, for example, the Lincoln Lab, MIT, to track this as small as 2 millimeters.
So with radar from the ground, they're able to track something that 2 millimeters?
Yes, I read that Lincoln Lab is able to do 2 millimeters in diameter using radar.
That seems, I don't know. I want to see that because that's pretty fancy.
It was at 1,000 kilometers. If that makes a difference.
At 1,000 kilometers, they're able to track something at 2 millimeters.
Yeah. Wait, let me find my reference.
Yeah, I need a reference for that one.
Yeah, so it wasn't the Lincoln Lab. It was the 70-meter Goldstone antenna located near Barstow, California.
Yeah.
Capable of detecting 2 millimeter debris at altitude below 1,000 kilometers.
What
See,
was their frequency? What radar frequency were they using? Like, what's the wavelength? Or that would be more appropriate for this.
does not say the frequency.
I would love to learn here, but I mean, radar bands are in the centimeters wavelengths, which should not, to my knowledge, be able to detect stuff at 2 millimeters. It just doesn't reflect right.
Okay, see, it's when it's operated as a bistatic radar, but I don't know what a bistatic radar is.
I don't know what a bistatic radar is either. Let's look that up, see if we can learn really quickly on that. Bistatic. Oh, it's the first hit, so the transmitter and a receiver that are separated by distance. Oh, okay. So one sends and the other one gets the bounce off it. It's not the same dish.
Oh,
Still, that's I don't know. I'm gonna have to take a good look at that
okay.
because something seems off there. I can understand if they were talking about 2 centimeters, tracking that, but 2 millimeters. That's if we could do that, then radar tracking for other purposes would be a lot better. Back to the conversation. So for risk margins, what I found was just historical for the space shuttle. So they had a rule that if the risk of collision of with the space shuttle was above 1 in 100,000, they would perform a avoidance maneuver unless it would significantly impact the mission. And unless the maneuver would significantly impact the mission. And if it was above 1 in 10,000, they'd perform a maneuver unless the maneuver would significantly risk the crew for some reason. So those are, I mean, when these things come up, which I don't know how often they are, but I'm assuming somewhat rare. That's not just constant risk, maneuver. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do any missions. We'd be using up all the RCS just to avoid all this stuff.
Yeah.
So it's pretty low. The threshold for okay, we need to do something is pretty low. Like, did you see what happened with SpaceX and what was that company that they were working with? Well, not they weren't working with, but there was an almost collision. Not even an almost collision. There was a risk. And they read two different numbers, which was kind of what happened here. And I think it was the ESA basically called up and said, "Hey, you guys need to do an avoidance maneuver," and SpaceX said no. And it turned out SpaceX was seeing a different risk assessment. It was like 1 in a million for them, but I think it's called Alana was the name of the satellite that they're worried about. Saw it as 1 in 1,000, under which SpaceX would have done the maneuver. So they did an avoidance maneuver, but there was this big hubbub about it, and there's a few articles written about SpaceX not playing nice in orbit, and it's over a 1 in 1,000 that doesn't come up very often.
Yeah.
So that seems to be how worried we are about it. So given that kind of makes risk assessment my focus here, and not that there's a huge danger of things happening, but just that given the margins, if we can't track everything that's up there or it gets too much, we're just going to be breaking that threshold so much that we won't be willing to launch anything until somehow we get it cleaned up.
Back to your colored thresholds, the red, yellow, and green. One use of this that I read about was actually during I believe it was the Iridium Cosmos collision, where the people on the ISS had to get into the Soyuz and prepare for
Emergency return.
avoidance maneuver. Yeah, because of the debris. It was a greater than a 1 in 1,000 chance of collision. So they had to operate in the red threshold.
Yeah, ready to go home. Yeah, they just sat there for a while, and I believe they did do a little bit of an avoidance maneuver too,
Really?
just to increase the margins for them.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, and that's costly too. They had to spend fuel and time. I mean, it does cost a lot of money for them to just be spending time up there and freaking everyone else out. I mean, it's possible that it could have reached another threshold where they're told, okay, you have to leave now, and then you have the station unmanned for a while, which I don't know how difficult it is to get back in there, given how we have been docking or berthing more to the point. You'd have to actually manually dock to get back on. I guess that's besides the point. Kessler syndrome. How familiar are you with this one?
I've read up on it a bit. It's in reaction or like the theoretical scenario of a chain reaction of collisions in orbit, right?
Yeah, 1978. So that's when it was proposed.
Yeah, and I was wondering if there's a more recent analysis of this.
I haven't seen a more recent analysis of it, but this is the one that I would thought, because I've seen this one posted places and I've seen animations of it.
Yeah.
And it gets used a lot as an argument, and I think it is inaccurate how they depict. Yeah. This is where I thought we might have a bit of a disagreement. To me, Kessler syndrome is the wrong way to look at it. It's going back to risk margins. It's not good to have a bunch of stuff up there that we can't track. And it's not to say collisions aren't a threat, because we have seen one, which I think was very unlikely to happen, but it shows those things can happen. But even them, I don't think that there's a risk of it cascading out of control. I don't suppose you've taken a lot of time looking into orbital mechanics.
Only I briefly scanned over it, I think, but not as much as you, I'm sure.
All right, so the way this thing is, Kessler syndrome, is often depicted. Imagine a satellite is at a certain altitude, and there's satellites at that altitude, and you have a collision, and then those pieces just spread out over this sphere, sort of. And I know there's probably people listening to this that say that's not actually what it says. I'm talking about how this is depicted. Is it spreading out over this sphere, and it's like, imagine a flat tabletop with like billiard balls, or saying you hit billiard balls, they bounce all over the place and they all hit each other. You get a reaction like that in that scenario. But that orbital sphere is not an actual surface that things travel on. When something is in orbit, it's actually on an orbital plane. It's following that same path over and over again, regardless of the Earth spinning. So it's going in essentially a ring, or an ellipse, more accurately. And it is very costly to change inclination, like to say rotate that ellipse so it's going on a different plane. That's actually a bigger cost for just as an analogy here, still with orbits. It's a bigger cost to Russia launching out of Baikonur to change the inclination to something more equatorial and to match the ISS than it is to just launch from somewhere northern that does not have the same Earth's rotational speed does at the equator is greater than near the poles. But yeah, like I said, it's more of a cost to do an inclination change. So when you have two satellites that collide, if it's anything that's going to result in essentially an explosion, that means there's a bunch of energy that you just released in that way that is no longer in kinetic energy. Because if it was changing inclination, which you're going to find out, and I'm not saying I'm basing this off of Kerbal Space Program, but anyone who's played Kerbal Space Program that's tried to do an inclination change has seen that when you do that, you drop the periapsis of the orbit. And with low Earth orbit, where most of our satellites are, that's going to drop it quickly into the atmosphere, which means that's not going to last very long. So you don't see this spread out that goes to the next orbit and then causes it, then those pieces collide with more satellites, and those pieces collide with more satellites. If you remember the video that we watched of the Iridium Cosmos collision, you saw 2 points following their orbits collide, and it looked at first like they spread out, but then as the camera moved around, they were all kind of in a line in their original orbit. So it's like taking, instead of 2 bullets, it turns into a shotgun blast, which is still generally in the same direction. Now, it's a greater risk to anything that might have collided with the original object on that path for a while. But overall, most of the pieces, not all of them, they can gain energy and they can do weird things, but the majority of it is going to, at some point, drop even lower into Earth's atmosphere, which is, we could consider it actually infinite. There's just a point where it's negligible, but a lot of it will drop to a point where it's not negligible and will quickly deorbit. So again, this is not to say that, Kessler syndrome isn't really an issue, so we don't have to worry about this. There's still the risk problem. If we just don't know where things are, if we get a few collisions that really muddy the risk assessment, we may not be willing to do a lot of stuff. We may not get the future we want, where we can go up as tourists. You say, no, it's not safe. Only these groups can actually go up into space. That would be a total bummer. Sorry, that was a little bit of a rant there.
No, I was going to try to argue back, but no, that made sense.
Argue back.
One question I have for you is, when we were watching the video of the Cosmos Iridium collision, they did have a specific, it was very it was almost perpendicular angle. Do you think that had something to do with the way the debris spread, or do you think that I'm not saying that this could happen, but if the debris were to hit head on to each other, do you think your
you would see even less inclination change, so it wouldn't be as much spread out? Theoretically. These are really messy collisions. It's hard, pretty difficult, and for me, impossible to calculate. But overall, you're going to have even more of a loss of so it's called specific orbital energy, which is just going to result in dropping down the periapsis dramatically. With them, the more in line their orbits are when they collide, the more they're going to of that energy they're going to actually retain and stay up in orbit. But I think, one thing, this is a complete tangent, but that collision proved that that collision happened at such high speeds. I guess we've done this with other stuff, but they didn't clip through each other, which does prove we're not living in a simulation. You hear that, Elon Musk? Not a simulation. Sorry. So the last thing we're going to touch on with this conversation was, what do we do about the junk up there? And there's 2 categories for this: prevent and remove. So in your mind, what do you think are the best ideas to prevent space junk?
There maneuvers, like you said, to avoid it, but preventing it, there's the idea of direct retrieval, but like space tugs and like lasers. I've read a lot on this, and there's a lot of different ideas.
Well, I'm talking about the prevent is the not produce junk or not leave junk. So
okay.
I want to focus on there a little bit first.
Okay, so there's the international guidelines and policies that have already been established by like the UN and other organizations, but I feel like if we were able to put in more heavy regulations, not just in specific countries, but to come to an international agreement, I feel like that would be one of the best courses of action to prevent further collisions and or not collisions, but keep our orbiting satellites as safe as possible.
Space management.
Yeah.
And so add to France and maybe I realized just now that earlier on I was referring to the ESA as the ESU for some reason. So ESA, maybe all of them could do it. I don't have great hope for us as a country, even though I think we have it pretty well as a practice, but actually passing a law saying you must do these things. But that would be good. So space law, I think, is going to be the big thing here, where at least we can get a good portion of the launch capable countries on board and enact it as law, and for other ones, kind of shame them. So international shaming. If we can't get them to sign on, at least do a lot of shaming. Shaming helps. Another area that we didn't actually talk about earlier on was there are some materials that just degrade. Like when you paint something that's going to go up there. Right? On our last podcast, we were talking about painting the Starlink satellites Fanta black. Well, paint does degrade, and that's absorbing a lot of energy from the sun. That's what it's designed to do. That should eventually start chipping off. So if paint chips are a problem, that's kind of worrying. But materials in general, I mean, you really have to do a lot of material science to make a satellite or anything to launch into space, because it has to survive it. And some stuff just for the course of a short mission, but some stuff's meant to be up there for a long time. So we want to make sure those things don't degrade and just start, sloughing off bolts into space.
Yeah.
Because some gasket or grommet started cracking under the UV that's not so protected up there.
So what would you suggest be different with the way satellites are currently being built? Because the Fanta black used on the Starlink is probably going to be necessary for other reasons. Do you have you thought of any possible solutions to the materials crisis?
Well, a good thing with just that scenario is that I believe a lot of those are meant to be replaced, like deorbited and then replaced somewhat often. So that takes care of them. So that does tie back into, if you can't make something that's not going to start degrading and start shedding parts off into orbit, we can't deorbit, then it shouldn't just be how much fuel do you have left to maintain your orbit. If you're going to start falling apart, then you need to deorbit now. But as far as getting the materials to where we want them, it's economics drives a lot of things, and if it's cheaper to launch something that's not as safe and there's no laws against it, then that's generally what companies are going to do. So I guess more shaming, public shaming. We want to make it popular. We want to make it something that gets applauded, or which in turn results in more customers. Say, hey, they actually care about this stuff. People want to use their services because they take the time to make it as safe as possible. And when they see it is degrading or it's going to, they've run the math, they deorbit them. So it's a little bit up to the consumer to say, we want providers that will actually do this. Because whether the consumer is individuals like us, because Starlink is supposed to bring internet to everybody. So if there is a competitor, which there are supposed to be, we'd say, hey, we want the one who's cleaner for orbit land. But it can also be companies that have their own customers, and they say, hey, don't use that provider because they're dirty. And then, of course, there's the staging junk, which, that falls into the same thing. I know I don't really remember specifics on this, but I know there have been some efforts recently to come up with staging systems that don't leave anything, that just deseparate and that's it, which would be nice. So, did you have anything more to add to the prevention?
Oh, I guess no, I don't have anything else to add to prevention. What about
Removal.
removal? Yeah.
Yeah, the cleanup. So, what have you seen? Because some of these I know are fun.
Yes, I've read all sorts of things. So I've heard of space tugs, lasers for smaller debris, tethers, magnetic sails, um, and a lot more. But the only problem with these is to retrieve a certain amount, without a purpose other than retrieving. It's going to be pretty costly.
Yeah. Here's the nasty economics again. Ruins everything. Yeah, it's like the same question of, well, why can't we make our highways better? Why can't we improve our infrastructure? Because that it doesn't make money. That just maintains what you already have, and who wants to do that, right? So it's pretty short sighted. So creating a market for it, or creating a point where it's actually cheap enough to. So I think that's what a lot of them are focusing on. So space tugs. Can you give a little bit more detail on that?
It seems like it'd be a spacecraft that would be used to move multiple pieces of debris.
So your space tech thing, again, this is a really off point thing, but it reminds me of one of my favorite video games growing up. Like in the this is in the 90s. This is when VGA was the top of the line graphics. Uh, um, there was this game called Space Quest. They made several of them, and you play a space janitor. That's the hero of the story. So it's one of those. The original one I think was completely type to adventure game, and then the upgrade to you click on stuff with your mouse, and it's a comedy. And in the fifth one, you actually go to the analog the Starfleet Academy in the game, and you cheat on a test to become a captain of a ship, and they give you a garbage scow. So that's actually what you're doing at first in the game, is going around and collecting garbage from orbit in your garbage scow.
That looks interesting.
I think you could find it for free. Everyone should check that out. They were great games. I wish they didn't stop.
Okay.
Yeah.
We cover everything?
Yeah, there were other removal things I saw. I mean, there's nets, like physical nets, and then there's electromagnetic nets that just kind of the object passes through, but it makes it so there is a momentum exchange. So the thing with the net gains some of the energy and it can still control itself, and the piece of debris that go through it lose a lot of their momentum. So in other words, they actually lose energy. So that'll lower their orbit on the other side, whether or not it's the periapsis. There is a slingshot idea, which I believe was supposed to be a physical connection where this thing would meet up with a piece of debris that it wanted to deorbit and really quickly spin and then let go. So it gained, it basically stole some of the piece of debris's momentum, and it goes on to the next one, which sounds really cool if it can do that, but I thought that one was pretty crazy. There's solar sails, which I don't see how that could be very effective. And okay, we're going to go attach a solar sail to everything. Well, it's really to another one that I've seen, not for debris, but the question of, which might be a future episode, I guess, is near Earth objects. Like we're going to get hit by an asteroid, and we've all seen the movies. Well, there's really two of them. We're speaking of Deep Impact and Armageddon, where they land on it and they drill in and then they blow it up with a nuke some way, just to set it off course. But from things I've seen, if you catch it quick enough, you can get to it, and all you need to do is find a way to brighten one side of it. Essentially paint one side or a good portion of one side white, and you end up with asymmetric radiation pressure on it, so the light from the sun is actually going to push it, and that will deflect it enough to go off course. So
Wow.
if you could have some stuff in low Earth orbit, it's at least a big enough size where you can do this. If you find a way to just brighten one side of it, I don't know, go up there with a little piece of a spray can. I don't know how feasible this is, but for some of the bigger objects, it seems like this could be a feasible option to just get something on it really quickly. Maybe a film that sticks to it. If you ever play with like gold leaf that they use in food, sometimes it gets really sticky. Just something like that that's really reflective, because the more reflective it is, the more radiation pressure is going to be imparted on it and will push it down. So that seems like a good idea. Copyright Logan Wilcox, 2020, or whatever. Patent pending. It's my idea, unless it's already been taken. Probably has somewhere. Anyway, yeah, I think we covered it. This has been fun.
Yeah. Thank you for watching Rocket Therapy, the official podcast of Edmonds College Rocketry. Like and subscribe, and remember,
up is easy, down is mandatory.